4. Ikikuro's health was painfully damaged by excessive fatigue, but for him, an even more terrifying enemy was targeting his life. Nakanishi Saburobe, who met an untimely death for Ikikuro's sake, was killed because of the actions of his retainers. As a result, his family was dissolved, and his only son, Jitsunasuke, who was 3 years old at the time, was raised by relatives. When Jitsunasuke turned 13, he heard for the first time about the untimely death of his father. In particular, upon learning that the assailant was not an equal samurai but rather a servant raised in his home, the boy's heart burned with indignation and regret. Immediately, he deeply engraved in his heart the singular purpose of revenge. He hurriedly entered the Yagyu dojo. After being granted full certification at the age of 19, he immediately set off on a journey of retribution. Encouraged by the words of his relatives, who said that if he successfully achieved his goal and returned, it would be the cornerstone for the revival of the family, he embarked on his quest. As Jitsunasuke traveled on unfamiliar paths, suffering many hardships, he journeyed through various provinces in search of the whereabouts of his enemy, Ikikuro. For Jitsunasuke, who had never even seen Ikikuro once, this search was as uncertain as grasping at clouds. He spent years wandering through the 5 provinces, Tokei, Higashiyama, Sanin, Sanyo, Hokuriku, and Nankai, continuing his empty journey until he was 27. His resentment and anger toward the enemy often faded amid the hardships of travel. However, thinking of his father's unjust death and the heavy responsibility of reviving the Nakanishi family, he would resolutely renew his resolve. After leaving Edo, he welcomed the spring of the 9th year in the castle town of Fukuoka. After fruitlessly searching the mainland, he felt compelled to explore the remote island of Kyushu. After moving from the castle town of Fukuoka to the castle town of Nakatsu, on a day in early February, he prayed at Usa Hachiman Shrine, wishing that he would achieve his long-held desire as soon as possible. After finishing his worship, Jitsunasuke rested at a tea house in the shrine grounds. At that time, he unexpectedly overheard a farmer next to him speaking to a fellow visitor. That monk over there originally came from Edo. It seems that he killed someone in his youth and repented for it, vowing to save others. They say that the Hida quarry was done entirely by that monk's effort. Upon hearing this story, Jitsunasuke felt an interest that he hadn't experienced in 9 years. He hastily asked, "Excuse me for my rudeness, but may I ask how old that monk is?" The man seemed pleased that his conversation had caught the attention of a samurai, and replied, "Yes, indeed. I haven't had the honor of seeing that monk, but according to rumors, he is nearly 60. Is he tall or short?" Jitsunasuke pressed further. "I can't say for certain. After all, he resides deep within the cave, so it's hard to tell. Do you know his secular name?" "I don't know that either, but he was born in Kashiwazaki, Echigo, and reportedly came to Edo in his youth," the farmer answered. Having heard this, Jitsunasuke jumped up in delight. When he left Edo, one of his relatives had cautioned him that the enemy, being from Kashiwazaki, Echigo, might return to his homeland, and he had been advised to search there with special diligence. Jitsunasuke felt that this was indeed a divine revelation from the Usa Hachiman Shrine. He asked for the old monk's name and the road leading to Yamaguni Valley, and although it was already past 8 o'clock, he gathered all his strength in his legs and hurried toward the enemy's location. Near the end of that day, as night approached, Jitsunasuke arrived at Hida village. He thought of heading directly to the cave but reminded himself not to rush. That night, he spent an anxious night at the Hida Station Inn and woke up early the next day, dressing lightly as he made his way toward the Hida quarry. When he arrived at the entrance of the cave, he asked a stonemason who was carrying out pieces of stone, "I hear that there is a monk called Ryukai in this cave, is that correct?" "Of course he is here. Ryukai is the same as the master of this shrine." "Ha ha ha," the stonemason laughed casually. Overjoyed, Jitsunasuke felt that he was close to achieving his goal. However, he reminded himself not to rush. Is there only one entrance here? He asked, for he feared his enemy might escape. That's obvious. Ryukai is enduring the suffering of fire and water to open the way over there, the stonemason replied. Jitsunasuke rejoiced at the thought that his long-standing enemy was now before him, as if a mouse had been placed in front of him in a bag. Regardless of how many stonemasons were there, he felt that it would be easy to kill him, and his spirit soared. I have a small request of you. Please tell Ryukai that I have come a long way to see him, he said. After the stonemason went into the cave, Jitsunasuke with the tip of his sword. In his heart, he imagined the appearance of the enemy he was about to confront for the first time. Although he was said to be over 50, since he was leading the excavation of the cave entrance, he must be a strong man. Particularly, he thought, since he was not unfamiliar with martial arts in his youth, he must not let his guard down. However, after a while, a beggar monk crawled out of the cave in front of Jitsunasuke. It would be more appropriate to say he crawled out than simply emerged. He was more a remnant of a human than a man. Flesh had all but fallen away, leaving only bones exposed. His joints below the legs were rotting in places, making it unbearable to look at him for long. Although he could be recognized as a monk by his tattered robes, his long hair covered his wrinkled forehead. The old monk blinked his gray eyes and looked up at Jitsunasuke, saying, "My eyesight is faded, I can hardly tell who is who." In that moment, Jitsunasuke's heart, which had been taut with tension, faltered upon seeing the old monk. He had longed for a villain he could deeply hate, someone he could loathe from the depths of his being. Yet before him squatted an old monk, half dead, who could hardly be identified as either human or corpse. Jitsunasuke began to feel disappointment in his heart but encouraged himself, asking energetically, "Is this the one known as Ryukai?" "Indeed, that is correct. And who might you be?" The old monk looked up at Jitsunasuke with curiosity. "Ryukai, no matter how much he disguises himself as a monk, surely has not forgotten. You, who were called Ikikuro, remember well the time you struck down my father, Nakagawa Saburube, and fled. I am his son, Jitsunasuke. Prepare yourself, for you can no longer escape," he declared. Jitsunasuke's words remained calm, yet they held an uncompromising severity. However, Ikikuro showed no sign of surprise upon hearing Jitsunasuke's words. "Is it really you, the son of Nakagawa, Jitsunasuke?" "No doubt, it was this Ryukai who drove your father away," he replied with a familiarity, as if meeting the child of an old master rather than confronting an enemy. Yet, Jitsunasuke thought he must not be deceived by Ikikuro's tone. "I have spent nearly 10 years in hardship to avenge the villain who struck down my master. Now that we meet here, let us engage in a fair battle, for you can no longer escape," he stated. Ikikuro showed no signs of fear. He felt a tinge of sadness at the thought of dying without fulfilling the great ambition he had to accomplish within the year, but he accepted that it was a result of his own wrongdoings and resolved himself to die. "Jitsunasuke, go ahead and cut me down. You may have heard, but this is the tunnel that Ryukai intended to dig to atone for his sins. After spending 19 years, I have completed about 90% of it. Ryukai will meet his end without being able to complete it any further. If you were to spill blood at the entrance of this tunnel and become a human pillar, I would have no regrets," he said, while blinking his unseeing eyes. As Jitsunasuke faced the half-dead old monk, he felt the hatred he had harbored toward his parents' enemy gradually fading away. The enemy was suffering for half his life, physically and mentally crushed by the sin of killing his father. Moreover, when Jitsunasuke introduced himself, the old monk was willing to sacrifice his life without hesitation. Jitsunasuke contemplated what kind of revenge it would be to take the life of such a half-dead old monk. However, unless he struck down this enemy, there was no way for him to end his long years of wandering and return to Edo. The idea of reviving his family's name seemed completely out of reach. Jitsunasuke began to consider shortening the life of this old monk out of calculation rather than hatred. Yet, for him, Killing a human without the fierce, burning hatred he felt was unbearable. He resolved to encourage the fading hatred in his heart as he prepared to strike down this unworthy enemy. At that moment, 5 or 6 stonemasons rushed out of the cave. Seeing the urgent situation with Ikikuro, they shielded him, exclaiming, "What will you do to Yabakei?" They wore expressions that suggested their actions would not be easily forgiven. "It's a matter of some importance, and I aim to target that old monk as my enemy. Today, I have encountered him, and I intend to achieve my purpose. If you try to stop me, I will not spare anyone," Jitsunasuke stated with a firm resolve. However, the number of stonemasons increased, and many passers-by stopped, surrounding Jitsunasuke and preventing him from touching Ikikuro even with a finger, each one beginning to breathe heavily with tension. To seek revenge on an enemy is still something that exists in the world. As you can see, Yabakei is a man in the form of a monk who has renounced worldly ties, and for the people of this mountainous region, he is regarded as the reappearance of a bodhisattva. One of them insisted, dismissing Jitsunasuke's quest for vengeance as an impossible desire. Yet, as he was obstructed by the crowd, Jitsunasuke's anger toward his enemy suddenly reignited. As a warrior, he could not simply stand idly by and walk away. Even if he wears the garb of a monk, he cannot escape the grave sin of murdering a lord. Anyone who hinders one seeking to avenge their parent's enemy shall not be spared, Jitsunasuke declared, drawing his sword from its scabbard. The crowd surrounding him braced themselves, ready for a confrontation. Then, at that moment, Ikikuro shouted in a hoarse voice, "Everyone, stand back. Yabakei is well aware that he deserves to be struck down. The excavation of this cave is solely for the purpose of atoning for his sins. Now, to have this filial son end my half-dead existence is Yabakei's lifelong wish. Everyone, there is no need to hinder him." As he said this, Ikikuro leaned forward, attempting to approach Jitsunasuke. The people around him, who were well aware of Ikikuro's strong will, understood that there was no way to change his resolve. It seemed that Ikikuro's life would end here. At that moment, the leader of the stonemasons stepped forward in front of Jitsunasuke and said, "You samurai must have heard about this as well, but this tunnel is a lifelong vow of Ryami, who has suffered for nearly 20 years, breaking his body and mind for this purpose. Regardless of his own misdeeds, how regrettable it would be to end his life just as he is on the verge of fulfilling his great wish. Our collective request, which will not take long, is that during the time it takes to complete this tunnel, could Ryami entrust his life to us. Once the tunnel is completed, we shall immediately make sure Ryami is safe." The crowd echoed in agreement, saying, "That is reasonable, that is reasonable." Hearing this, Jitsunasuke felt he could not ignore their plea. He thought it better to wait for the completion of the tunnel than to try to take revenge on his enemy while being obstructed by the crowd. He believed that Ikikuro, who was even now willingly ready to be slain, would feel obligated to surrender his life if the tunnel were completed. Moreover, aside from such calculations, allowing this old monk to fulfill his great vow, even as his enemy, was not an unpleasant thought. Jitsunasuke looked equally at Ikikuro and the crowd and said, "I will allow Ryami, in the form of a monk, to fulfill his wish. I will not forget the words that have been tangled. There is no need to worry. If this tunnel connects even a little, whether it's a 1-inch hole or a 1-foot hole, once it reaches the other side, we shall not leave that spot until Ryami is defeated. Until then, please remain leisurely around here," the foreman of the stonemasons said in a gentle tone. Seeing that this commotion would be resolved safely, Ikikuro, feeling that the time wasted was indeed regrettable, crawled into the cave. Jitsunasuke was frustrated that an unexpected disturbance had prevented him from achieving his goal at such a crucial moment. Holding back the pent-up frustration that he couldn't help, he was guided by one of the stonemasons into a wooden hut. When he was alone and reflecting, he could not help but feel regret for being unable to defeat his enemy despite being right before him. His heart was gradually filled with irritating anger. He had completely lost the relaxed attitude of waiting for the tunnel's completion. He resolved to sneak into the cave that very night and slay Ikikuro. However, just as Jitsunosuke was keeping watch over Ikikuro, the stonemasons were keeping watch over him. For the first 2 or 3 days, he passed his time aimlessly and without thought, but on the evening of the 5th day, he felt a resolve. As was customary each night, it seemed the stonemasons had let down their guard, and by the time of the ox, several had fallen into a deep sleep. Jitsunosuke decided that tonight was the night. He abruptly sat up, pulled a sword from beside his pillow, and quietly stepped outside the wooden hut. It was a clear night in early spring, with the moon shining brightly. The waters of the Yamaguni River flowed in swirling shades of blue under the moonlight. Ignoring the scenery around him, Jitsunosuke stealthily approached the cave entrance, careful not to stumble over the scattered stone fragments that caused him pain with each step. Inside the cave, the moonlight streamed in from the entrance and through several openings, casting a faint glow here and there. He felt his way along the right-hand rock wall, moving deeper into the cave. After advancing about 2 cho from the entrance, he suddenly heard a sound echoing from the depths of the cave, a quack-quack sound that came intermittently. At first, he could not discern what it was. However, with each step forward, the sound grew louder until it reverberated through the night stillness, echoing within the cave. It was unmistakably the sound of a hammer striking against the rock wall. Jitsunosuke felt his heart pound fiercely at the mournful and fierce sound. As he drew closer, the sharp sound, like that of breaking jewels, echoed around the cave and struck his ears with ferocity. He crawled toward the sound, believing that its source must surely be his enemy, Ryokai. Wetting the edge of his blade in preparation, he held his breath and crept closer. At that moment, amidst the rhythm of the hammering, he heard Ryokai's voice, as if whispering or moaning, reciting scriptures. That hoarse, mournful voice washed over Jitsunosuke like a deluge. In the dead of night, when all were gone and the grasses and trees were asleep, the figure of Ryokai, sitting alone in the dark and wielding his hammer, vividly imprinted itself on Jitsunosuke's mind amidst the inky darkness. He was no longer just a human. Beyond the emotions of joy, anger, sorrow, and happiness, he embodied the fearless, diligent spirit of a bodhisattva, simply swinging his iron hammer. Jitsunosuke realized that the grip on his sword had loosened without him noticing. Suddenly, he regained his awareness. In the face of a noble, high-minded saint who had already attained a state of Buddhahood and was tasting the bitter struggles for the sake of all beings, he reflected on how he was drawing his sword in anger like a beast, ready to strike in the deep darkness of midnight. A strong shiver coursed through his body. The powerful sound of the hammer that shook the cave and the solemn chant of the ninbutsu shattered Jitsunosuke's heart completely. He thought he had no choice but to wait patiently for the day of completion, to wait for the fulfillment of that promise. Filled with deep emotion, Jitsunosuke crawled out of the cave toward the moonlight outside. Shortly after that, among the stonemasons working on the tunnel, Jitsunosuke was seen in his samurai attire. He no longer held any fierce intentions to ambush the old monk. Knowing that Ryokai would not flee or hide, he decided to wait for the day when Ryokai would fulfill his lifelong vow. Even so, realizing that rather than waiting in a daze, he could shorten the date of his revenge by dedicating even a little of his strength to this grand endeavor, Jitsunosuke began to swing a hammer alongside the other masons. As enemies stood side by side, swinging their hammers, Jitsunosuke worked desperately, hoping that the day of fulfilling his true wish would come sooner. Since Jitsunosuke's appearance, Ryokai likely wished to realize his great aspiration as quickly as possible to grant the wishes of this filial son. He, too, exerted himself with renewed courage, smashing the rock walls as if he were mad. In the meantime, the moon came and went. Jitsunosuke's heart was moved by Ryokai's great courage, and he began to forget his own hatred toward the enemy involved in this grand project. Even in the dead of night, when the masons were resting from their daytime fatigue, the enemy stood side by side, silently swinging their hammers. It was the night of September 10th in the third year of Enkyo, 21 years since Ryakai struck the first blow in the tunnel at Hida, and a year and 6 months since Jitsunasuke encountered him. On this night, all the stonemasons had retreated to their hut, leaving only Ryakai and Jitsunasuke to tirelessly swing their hammers despite the day's fatigue. As the night approached 9 o'clock, Ryakai swung his hammer down with all his might, striking with no response as if hitting rotten wood. His right palm, holding the hammer, struck the rock, causing him to exclaim, "Ah!" At that moment, even through his dim and clouded eyesight, Ryakai unmistakably saw the silhouette of the Yamaguni River illuminated by moonlight through the small hole that his hammer had broken. Ryakai let out a shout that seemed to shake his entire body, followed by a joyful laughter that echoed wildly through the cave, as if he had gone mad. "Jitsunasuke, look here. The great vow of 21 years has finally been fulfilled tonight." As he said this, Ryakai took Jitsunasuke's hand and showed him the flow of the Yamagunagawa through a small hole. Below that hole, the dark soil was unmistakably part of the road alongside the riverbank. Enemies, now hand in hand, were choked with tears of great joy. However, after a moment, Ryakai stepped back and said, "Now, Jitsunasuke, it's the promised day. Cut me down. If I were to die in the midst of this profound bliss, there's no doubt I would be born into the pure land of paradise. Please, cut me down. By tomorrow, the stone masons will come and hinder us, so do it now." His hoarse voice echoed through the cave's night air. But Jitsunasuke sat there with his hands clasped, choking on his tears. As he watched the withered old monk, filled with joy that surged from the depths of his heart, the thought of killing him as an enemy never crossed his mind. More than the desire for revenge, his heart was filled with wonder and admiration for the remarkable feat accomplished by this frail human being. He moved closer and took the old monk's hand once again. The two forgot everything in that moment, weeping together in a shared emotional embrace.